She's coming from FAO. As you may know, Telefónica and FAO just signed an agreement a few months ago, and we are very excited because demand-side agencies are critical towards the success. I was told in Telefónica sometimes, hey, well, how is that going that demand-side agencies are asking Telefónica for data? And this is not the right way to formulate the question. Actually, these agencies are asking questions, and we are helping them to solve these questions whenever we can. So they don't ask for data, they want to answer questions that are relevant for the human being. So Natalia, please, is here. So.
Thank you. Buenos días. ¿Me escuchan? Sí. Buenos días, soy Natalia Winder, representando a la FAO. Muchas gracias a Telefónica por la invitación. Yo soy el Senior Advisor de un programa de resiliencia dentro de la FAO, entonces estoy representando un grupo diverso, multidisciplinario, de analistas, expertos del sector agrícola, seguridad alimentaria, protección social y cambio climático. Y lo que les quiero presentar es un poco el enfoque de la FAO con respecto a cambio climático, el enfoque sobre resiliencia y digamos, las nuevas preguntas que nos estamos haciendo con respecto al uso de datos, sobre todo para poder responder de una manera mejor al trabajo que hacemos, sobre todo para los más pobres y vulnerables. I'm going to switch to English because it's easier for me to present in English technical terms, so I apologize for that. That's not a good picture. Next. Okay. So what I want to present is first the current context. What are we talking about when we think about the impact of climate-related risks on the agriculture sector? Because, of course, that's the main area and interest of FAO. Why do we focus on disaster risks? I want to share with you a work that we're doing around quantifying the impact on agriculture, around damage and loss. And also a project or initiative around early warning and for early action, which is mainly trying to anticipate the impact around agriculture and also proposing some early actions to decrease, if you want, the negative impact across the agriculture sector. A little bit about FAO's approach around resilience, and then, you know, a snapshot around the current partnership with Telefónica. This is not new, but it's definitely our starting point. Poverty and hunger are present. 767 million people still live in extreme poverty. 2 of 3 are living in, those that live in extreme poverty are in the rural areas, and therefore it's a key focus of our work. Most of them depend on agriculture, either for full-time job and full-time income or as part of their income sources. But I think we have an additional issue around poverty and an exclusion is that most of the extreme poor also are living in areas that are fragile in terms of environmental risk, but also in terms of conflict. And I think that's, adding an extra layer in terms of how we have to think in order to identify key practices around poverty reduction and reaching zero hunger. We know that it requires a serious attention and also a change in our perspective. Business as usual is no longer an option. We know that most of those that produce the food that we eat every day are small-scale family farmers. Small-scale family farmers that face multiple constraints in terms of access to social services, such as social protection and social insurance, in terms of financial services, such as credit, in terms of access to innovative technologies and practices. Even though there's many agencies, many organizations that are investing in new and innovative agriculture practices, the economic and social barriers to access those practices is still huge, particularly among small-scale producers. Moreover, we know that the agricultural livelihoods are particularly affected year after year with a series of disasters, and we've clustered them in 3 types of disasters, right? Natural hazard-induced disasters, food chain crisis, as well as conflict and protected crisis. And we all know that even though we can classify them in nice boxes, these are usually acting in a compounding way in the same territory, further exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. We know that the impacts are twofold. One, in terms of reduced production and therefore economic loss for farmers and their families. but also it goes beyond the short-term immediate impact on income, but also further impacting in terms of loss of harvest, livestock, and of course, the long-term reversal around poverty reduction gains. We've been working, and we have a big area of work in FAO that tries to understand the trends around food security and nutrition. And we have two flagship reports that were launched last year and also this year that I think had a very similar message. It's a worrisome message around the rise in the number of people that are suffering hunger and malnutrition. And the number of crises in terms of climate and conflict that are recurrent and are impacting food security in a very negative way. The main areas or territories where we see and where we saw a rise in hunger and malnutrition are precisely those that are affected by conflict and disaster. And that was first in the State of the Food Global Security and Nutrition, the SOFI of last year, which is a joint project and joint report between FAO, UNICEF, WFP, IFAD, and the World Health Organization, trying to understand the trends around hunger and malnutrition. And again, most of the profound and worried increases in terms of hunger and malnutrition were found in contexts affected by conflict and climate-related emergencies. This year, we launched a further zoom into countries that are at the birth of famine, looking at 124 million people in 51 countries are facing food insecurity or worse. That means that people are not able to meet their basic food security needs in 51 countries. And again, most of these crises are mainly in contexts affected by conflict and disaster and climate disasters. We've put a lot of, I think, of effort from the analytical side in trying to understand, not just increase the visibility of why it's important to take a closer look on the impact of climate on agriculture, but also that this is translating into a very strong economic loss for farmers as well as for the overall economy. So I want to discuss a little bit the findings of a report that was launched this year around how much cost what is the damage around agriculture in terms of how much it will cost to repair or replace destroyed assets, particularly in agriculture, as well as the specific changes and losses in terms of economic loss. So we call the damage and loss report. This, I feel like in a tech talk, so I have to move from one place. One used to, be in a podium trying to read your notes. It's not happening today. Okay, so the report, I think, is very clear. It's trying to have a clear understanding of what is the impact of disasters in the agriculture sector and how can we use that information to design better policies to anticipate, respond, and mitigate that impact. I think there's two key messages that I will try to explain throughout the slides. No? Conflicts have caused both short and long-term agricultural losses, estimated in around 4.3 million per year, and this is an estimation from 1970 to 1997. And we have 500 million people in conflict crises where hunger levels are 3 times higher than their average. So we have a base situation of a very high number of people living in hunger and high levels of malnutrition. This is further exacerbated, of course, in the context of fragility, crisis, and climate change. The report provides a lot of very rich information and data, trying to make a very strong case and raising the visibility around damages loss in agriculture. I think this graph is particularly useful because it shows that the natural disasters have hit every continent and every year and every region of the world continuously, and it's been growing in terms of number, but also in terms of intensity. The impact has been increasing. We saw a peak around 2012 and 13, and the economic loss is huge for the small-scale farmers, but I think most importantly when we see it in an overall macroeconomic picture affecting economy. Even for countries where the agriculture sector is not necessarily the biggest share of the GDP, it still translate into a very important impact in terms of food production and agriculture development. The agriculture sector by itself absorbs 23% of all the damage and loss created by climate-related risks. These are just the examples of the percentage in terms of damage per se, and then the percentage in terms of loss. So we're talking a very hard hit into a sector that is per se also lagging behind vis-a-vis other sectors such as industry or infrastructure. The report also goes into in-depth in terms of discussing that, of course, the impacts are not homogeneous among the different sectors within the agriculture sector. So differences in the impacts around crops, around fisheries, forestries, and therefore different types of policies and strategies to be able to overcome those. So for instance, drought remains the most harmful disaster, causing 86% of total damage in this sector. But when we zoom in, for instance, in the fisheries and agriculture sector, this is, of course, mainly affected by floods and storms. We also did a specific zoom into the impact of the conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic, where, of course, we have been committed to supporting the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the agriculture sector being a key source of the GDP of that country. There is a 16 billion of the overall financial cost of the conflict in the agriculture sector. We usually see the very worrisome, high headlines around life loss. We're not only talking about lives lost, but also livelihoods lost. That in a period that when we're trying to think about recovery and reconstruction, there is an extra hurdle to be passed. The report is very big, it's very rich. I didn't want to show every single result because I want you to read the report. But I think it was very interesting to show and quantify when we're talking about damage and loss, and not just having an overall statement, but go very in-depth into the real impact around livelihoods. When we think about humanitarian crisis, understandably so, the first thing that we think about is to saving lives. However, there's also a very strong push around how do we start preventing the loss of livelihood when we're thinking about recovery, reconstruction, and resilience? That is a big, big part of the process. The document also goes into a discussion on, okay, we have this methodology, we've been able to gather data, we have interesting results about damage and loss, but we also have very key gaps in terms of the quality and the reliance of information that we're using to make these types of calculations. So there were, recommendations around trying to improve the adequacy, the timeliness of the data that is collected, but most importantly, how to improve the capacity of national stakeholders at community and national level to be able to collect that data more systematically and with more accuracy. How to give voice to those that are, the main agents of change, farmers, small-scale producers. How can they have access to more reliant, time-sensitive information so they can be much more able to have contingency plans and resilience-linked plans? How can we strengthen partnership with the private sector to be able to enhance the quality and reliance of information? In terms of improved mechanisms for data collection, the support to the National Statistical Office, and also trying to think about a cross-cutting, multi-sectoral approach to addressing impacts around agriculture. It's not just the business of the agriculture sector, but also of the wider group of stakeholders that are also contributing as well as benefiting from food production and agriculture sector, which is, at the end of the day, the whole economy. The second piece of analytical work that we've been working on is this methodology around early warning and early action. Basically, systems of information and data that translate into early warning information provided to national and subnational stakeholders, and trying to define, based on that information, key anticipatory actions to reduce, minimize some of the negative impact of a specific disaster or event. We have is a system that consolidates information from different systems from FAO and from partners. The GEWIS, for example, which is a global information system based to trying to identify the types of crops. The food crisis report that I showed you before. Different types of early warning information that is existing at a country level, and trying to build, a set of comprehensive indicators that allow us to forecast. This is what in the scenario 1, and scenario 2, and scenario 3 can happen to this particular context because its risk is prone to crises. We divide the risk in terms of high watch, on watch, depending, of course, on the likelihood of the potential impact at global level, but most importantly at country level. So this is the kind of risk map that we produce through this process, trying to understand and trying to classify territories within countries around the different kinds of risks, but also the intensity and the livelihood of that particular risk to happen. And I know that that's a little bit generic, so I wanted to zoom in one specific example of how we apply this methodology in Kenya, for instance. It was a pilot that was implemented in 2016. The specific request or objective was to safeguard livestock assets, income, and the food security of a particular population, pastoralists, which is in many cases, as you may know, are hardest, the most vulnerable to climate-related risk, particularly droughts. And there was a series of activities that were put forth that could help mitigate the impacts or minimize the potential impacts of drought, such as providing livestock feed and supplement, the rehabilitation of water holes, provision of water, as well as big work around animal health. So a roadmap was developed. There was data was collected in terms of, for instance, rainfalls, forest conditions, food security projected impacts, the current assets of the community. And then instead of waiting for the particular risk to happen, the action was put forth before it happened, and in that way, minimizing particular negative effects. We were one of the first responders because we were able to anticipate some of the impacts around the crisis. There were significant improvement in terms of livelihood, particularly in the areas where the intervention was targeted. The livestock, regardless of the drought, remained functional and was continuing able to provide some level of resilience to the territory. But most importantly, this information was integrated into the Kenyan National Disaster Information System. In that way, not only being an FAO project-related tool, but integrated into a national response system. And I think that is one of the key messages and perspectives or objectives of the work that we do. It's important to have innovative pilots and innovative new ways of working, but as a UN organization, we're mostly interested in trying to enhance the capacity of governments, and when they don't exist, of communities and subnational level stakeholders to also be agents of change when identifying risk, but also when better responding to it. And I don't have a voice now. Okay. Oops, sorry. Back. Okay. In the discussion around both the early warning area action as well as the damage and loss report, there were a lot of questions, particularly from the technical area of FAO, of like, okay, this is interesting, but we definitely will need to have and to expand our partnership with the private sector in order to enhance the way that we collect data, that we analyze data, and that we improve also the adequacy and the time sensitive of that data. So for example, there were many questions around how can we enhance the way that we're collecting data to enhance our damage and loss methodology. Can we have a way to get not only data that is 2 months, 3 months old, but something that is time sensitive on the day, on the exact moment of the crisis? And the accuracy of the assessments in terms of, with a geo satellite type work, and trying to really get information that is not only being dependent on information, on focus groups, on you know, the traditional way that we collect data and statistical agencies collect data, but you know, leveraging new technologies that are coming that way. And I'm sure that's going to be part of the discussions during the panel, and I'm sure from the next presentations. As I said before, how are we enhancing the capacity of the stakeholders to better use, collect, and analyze this data? It's great that we have the capacity to do it. We need to translate that in a much more systematic way. And of course, because I work on social protection, there were also questions that I raised around. We have a big work around social protection systems, cash transfer, school feeding programs. We're trying to use existing social protection systems to better channel humanitarian aid in the context of an emergency. Instead of doing it after the crisis happened, how can we better leverage the information that we have in the early warning and early action system, for example, or in the damage and loss methodology, to create triggers so that that response through the social protection system comes before a crisis happens? We still have not figured out how we can do that in a systematic and cost-efficient way. 10 minutes, perfect. Can I just have water before I... To make it very interactive, I come. I have to say, this is very intimidating. I feel like, you know, we're used to being at a podium and be very like dry and, okay. So, FAO has a new strategic framework that tried to make the organization more responsive to the current situation and to use, even though the focus continues to be, you know, rural development, food security, zero hunger, there was definitely you know, the realization that we had to take into account the reality of the different factors that are affecting those three areas of work, particularly social issues, rural poverty, resilience, climate change. So the organization changed some years ago and focusing on 4 strategic programs. I'm going to focus on the last one in terms of increase the resilience of livelihoods to threats and crises. We're working, of course, and we're focusing around smallholders. That's, I think, the main area of work, particularly when we talk about rural poverty and resilience. We want to support those that are dependent on agriculture in all the subsectors in terms of crop production, fisheries, forestries, particularly those that their livelihoods are dependent on natural resources, and trying to protect, to enhance the resilience on the 3 big types of risks, which are natural hazards and disasters, food chain crisis, and protracted crisis. And when we talk about protracted crisis, we're integrating the conflict element. There's 4 pillars around governing crisis and disaster risk, monitoring, preparedness, and also application of mitigation measures. And it's not seen necessarily as a one step after the other, but of course as a cycle that should be fitting one step into the other. Very quickly, I'm not going to go into detail in each of the outcomes, but I thought it was important maybe to focus on 2. This one is around governance and risk crises, and the work here is mainly around promoting the adaptation of guidance and, you know, national level legislation that will really help us to define at country level disaster reduction plans, early action time programs, enhance the legal framework of a country in order to better respond to a particular crisis. But I think the key area, and maybe the one of most interest in this particular forum, is around the monitoring, the watch to safeguard, as we call it, not trying to help countries and regions to provide regular information, anticipating information to better manage, prevent, and mitigate the impacts of emerging threats. Some of the reports that I mentioned, the early warning one, the global report crisis, and also the IPC, which is our way of classifying countries based on their likelihood of their population to be food insecure, from early warning to famine status. I think there's a lot of work that has been put forth with partnership with the Statistics Division and with other partners outside of FAO, such as, you know, FuseNet, WFP, and others. but there's definitely space to enhance our capacity to use data in a much better way and to collect it in a much more cost-efficient way. The third one is around what are the elements or strategies and policies that we can put forth in order to prevent or minimize some of the threats. And of course, issues around conflict-sensitive measures, social protection, agroforestry are key in that regard, as well as some of the actual humanitarian response that we as FAO provide in our focus of saving livelihoods. I think the key in this discussion is that we would like to decrease let's say the appeal of the need in this particular area of work is increasing. It's becoming unmanageable, and definitely the refocus or a reinvestment around the preparedness and the better monitoring of information should help us to better manage that increasing demand. A parenthesis, because I work in this area and I think it's critical for our discussion, is even though we're thinking about using new technologies and new types of data collection or new types of technology to better help us to manage risk, it's also important to think about the structures that are already present and existing in a particular country that can help us to better channel the response that we're trying to make. And FAO is putting a lot of effort around enhancing the risk-informed and the shock responsiveness of national social protection systems, cash transfer national systems, school feeding national systems. Systems that already have a very broad and comprehensive targeting methodology that already should be including most of the poorest and vulnerable populations in a particular territory, and that already have a very strong delivery mechanism that could be used and further strengthened to deliver aid. What are the gaps there? What I said before, how to link this delivery or this response with much more efficient early warning systems. How do we make the cash payments much more mechanized and transparent? But it's definitely an area of work that is not necessarily the traditional agricultural FAO type interventions, but just an example of the kinds of new innovative tools that we're integrating into our work around resilience. I wanted to just briefly talk about the very successful MOU that we have between FAO and Telefónica, which is basically trying to, us as FAO, trying to bring to the attention of organizations such as Telefónica, what are the main gaps that we have in terms of data, in terms of innovation, and trying to find common collaborative solutions to better help our national counterparts as well as the small-scale farmers. There's 4 active pilots, for example, promoting the use of digital technologies, particularly to enhance the damage and loss methodology that I mentioned to you, focusing in Chile. In Ecuador, how to support the access of accurate meteorological information early enough to farmers so they can better plan and identify the way to better respond or protect their particular access, particularly in the verge, in the context of weather-related risks. Trying to also enhance with the experience of a private sector agency, the capacity of national stakeholders to better enhance their data collection and data analysis needs. And then a water sensing program in Latin America, again, trying to get technology for the purpose of better policy work. I thank you very much for your attention. I know that it was very, overarching presentation focusing on the needs, and I hope that the discussion will open up on what will be some of the solutions for the issues that we're trying to tackle at FAO. Thank you very much.